The one I think about actually a lot is that until a journalist asks, like, where's the Congress? Like, why aren't they in Congress doing their job? And it's, oh, because they're in a memory home.
Mondays with Mike.
Mondays with Mike. Mondays with Mike.
Nancy Pelosi won't seek re-election. Nancy Pelosi came to office in the House of Representatives in 1987, so she has enjoyed an illustrious career which will likely stretch 40 years. Yes, that's right, about 40 years. And she served as Speaker of the House twice, the first time beginning in 2007, and then I believe she remained Minority Leader from 2011 to 2019 when she became Speaker again, 2019 to 2023. The next thing that comes to mind in my mind is that she's a divisive figure, but I think the divisiveness is drummed up by the media. I don't know what it's based on, so I don't even know if I want to put that in. But she's getting up there in years. She was born in 1940, which...
Yeah, World War II.
Yeah, member of the silent generation, older than President Biden, as a matter of fact. So, it's often stated, we need more young people in politics. What do you think of that? Do you think that's true? Do you think we do need more young people in politics?
Sure. Yeah, they're affected by political choices too. Probably more important in terms of politics is that when you have older generations deciding the future, they're deciding things that they themselves won't be really impacted by. It's things that their kids and their grandkids will be affected by. There's an argument to be made that they feel less of a stake in the game, that in terms of things like climate change or things like, the price of certain things that they may already have because they're older and wealthier. So housing, cars, or even something like how difficult it is to get an entry level job, a beginning job. If they are already safe and secure and prosperous in their position, they may not see the urgent need of resolving those issues that younger people may have felt or are feeling by comparison. For example, AOC or Mamdani are examples of younger people running for office because they see a much greater impact on their lives, and that now is the time to have a say on those issues because that's how you affect change. And in particular, the things that I worry about when you have such an elderly group of people who are in the Senate and the House and running government across the board is actually technology. It's AI and understanding the ramifications of how ubiquitous this technology is and also how invasive in your life it can become in terms of things like social media or cell phones and texting, that if you don't see it and feel it on a daily basis compared to some of these younger generations for like video games or anything like that, you don't fully comprehend just how serious those issues can be, especially for AI. And younger people are much more using the technologies and they're early adopters for a lot of these things just as a function of being younger, or there's a sort of social pressure. If all your friends are playing video games or social media as a certain thing, Twitter or TikTok or all these different kinds of social media, they're more quick to learn and adapt and understand these technologies compared to the older generations. Government is a tool, and if you don't adapt to figuring out how to use government in a way to navigate the current reality, if you're living in the past in a world where it was less expensive to find housing, it was easier to get a job, you could walk in and give your resume and shake the manager's hand and be like, hire me. And they're like, yeah, we'll hire you. Great. If you don't fully comprehend the difficulty of making ends meet in the current reality, then there's a serious delay in making any kind of realistic change and actually helping people. That's how you get these situations where people are clamoring for change, however misguided, from the guy who tells them that he'll do it. Yeah, I'll bring down the price of eggs. I'll bring down the price of milk. I'll make everything cheaper with tariffs. You've got to actually understand what's going on and feel its impact. And yeah, I do think it's a good idea to have younger people in politics. But the other unfortunate reality is that it's really difficult. There's a serious barrier to entry. If you want to become a member of the House of Representatives, you need a lot of money. And so the question becomes, if any young person actually wants to even get a job in politics, where do they start? Do they start at city councils, school boards? Do they work as interns or do they work as staff on campaigns for these elected officials? And if you really want to get into that for the elected officials, one of the issues is if you have somebody who's an incumbent for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, their staff gets pretty fixed in terms of who they hire to the main staff. Sure, they'll cycle through like pages and interns, but in terms of the real like staff on Capitol Hill, you're going to have the same people who become ensconced in this power. And the one I think about actually a lot is that congressperson who was in a memory home and nobody figured it out until a journalist asked, like, where's the congressperson? Like, why aren't they in Congress doing their job? And it's, oh, because they're in a memory home. It was a Texas representative. Let me see.
Texas person. Okay.
Memory home. It was Kay Granger. She was in a senior living facility. The issue was that she missed all the votes, but her staff were still getting paid and they were still doing like work things. But the issue is that when you get to a certain level in politics where the money is, where you actually get like a paying job, people are understandably, but still unwilling to just give up their jobs and their money and their power, even if the responsible thing is that once somebody's no longer able to do their job that they've been elected to do, that they have to quit, right? They have to get fired or quit. The tools to do that are the elections, right? There's also ways that they can remove someone from office, similar to how a president can be fired with the 25th Amendment for Congress and the Senate if it's found that they are physically unable to do the job, right? But the problem, and it's a real problem, there was a congressperson from Washington. He wanted to pass a dementia test pretty much for all members of Congress, that they would have to pass a test that says, I am capable of like retaining memories and making decisions of my own volition. That kind of thing. Yeah, that failed.
I
right?
wonder if I would pass that test.
Yeah, no, that effort failed. Because and it's, oh, I wonder why that effort failed. Maybe because these older Congress people understand that like it's one of the only jobs that I can think of where you don't have to meet some like minimum standard of being able to do the job, right? That's how you get 100-year-old Congress people and 95-year-old Congress people and 90-year-old Congress people. Because in almost any other job, you have to have some ability to actually do the job, right? You can't have a 90-year-old pilot, 100-year-old pilot, 90-year-old bus driver just like driving along. They have to undergo like actual evaluations. They have to demonstrate at least a minimum ability to actually do the job that they've been hired to do. The issue is pretty obvious that if, I don't know, 80 or 90% of the people who would be affected by a policy have the power to decide whether they're actually going to impose the policy on themselves, they're probably not going to do it. Who's going to make them? Themselves? No. And that's why you need younger people, in part, in politics, is they can help hold the older people more accountable to actually doing their jobs. These are serious issues. You don't want people who are unable or unwilling to understand reality in positions where they can shape reality. If they make mistakes, those mistakes can be very serious. Declarations of war, spending money, not taking an issue seriously enough to actually send the resources to that issue, but also just on the big votes, impeachment votes. If there are people who don't have the ability to understand the situation that actually happened and then make a reasoned decision based off of the information they receive, then when the moment arrives that maybe somebody who holds all the power needs to be voted out because they've broken some cardinal rule or done something that was sufficient enough for them to get kicked out of office, and they don't vote because they don't know, that's a huge disservice to everybody in the country that elected them to represent their interests and be their voice. I do think that if the only actual check on people not retiring when they can't do the job anymore is that they get voted out, and there need to be a lot more younger people running for office and winning seats, because that's the way you get elected to the higher stuff, is that you show experience in politics, governing, being an executive, being a state representative or state senator. So 100%, there needs to be a lot more young people in politics. The problem is that the younger generations are poorer, and in order to run for office, you either have to be a millionaire, or you have to be able to convince millionaires to give you money, or to convince thousands of people to give you $5, $10, sufficient that you can compete on an even playing field. And that's not so easy when you're younger. It's easier when you're older and have more connections, networks, and know more people.
Sure. Okay. I'm thinking about, like, for example, here in Washington, we've got Murray and Cantwell. And an argument that I hear whenever they're up is, and maybe this is just the circles I've run in, is they've been in there for a while, and so they've got connections, and the state benefits from those connections. And I'll tell you the truth, I'm pretty persuaded. I think to myself, that is a logical reason for people from this state to vote for those people. Those are just the first two that come to mind. But then it's a matter of perhaps what is in the interest of the individual constituencies may not be in the interest of the whole. Because who do Americans disapprove of most? It's not actually Congress, but Congress as a whole, they don't really like them. But there are a lot of safe seats out there. So that's the incentive trap that I see, at least. What do we do about it? I don't even know where to go based on that. Yeah, it makes sense for the individual, but it's making this system. What next?
If you want a real answer, it would be public funding of elections, that everybody has to operate with the same budget. So what would happen is you have a primary or some kind of system where someone gets elected, and then once you have your slate of representatives that are in the general election, they all operate from the same pool of money. That's it. That nobody can donate extra money, they can't give any gifts, that everybody's on an even playing field. Absent that, what we're left with is the situation we have now post Citizens United, which is that if rich billionaires or corporate CEOs who can funnel money into your election, you're probably going to win in any competitive race, period. If people who can just contribute huge sums of money, it's really hard to compete in a country this big with the sort of balkanized media that we have, unless you can actually reach people where they are. And that takes money, a lot of money.
Returning to the idea of young people getting elected and that being important, you have at first the image of Mark Zuckerberg being grilled by Congress people, and then one of the older gentlemen being like, why am I getting these notifications on my phone? It's like tech support with Grandpa. But if the Grandpa is a congressperson and the grandson is a tech billionaire. But so in terms of not being able to relate to the technologies that shape our world and the states of affairs, the people in power, like a lot of them, don't have a grasp on it much of the time. And there seems to be a cultural thing where you gotta explain things at a basic level, and there's this tolerance for not being all there. Whereas maybe if you just meet Grandma, of course you're going to be tolerant of her, but you're in an important job. Why haven't you done your homework?
Yeah, so that's the other big issue is if they become so comfortable in their power, they don't feel any pressure, especially in these safe seats, that anyone's ever going to actually run against them, right? Because they have all the experience and the money and the power. Then there's less of a pressure on their end to actually care, to actually do the homework, read, study. So the Congressional Research Service and the Library of Congress are one of the biggest research libraries in the whole planet, that they've got a huge amount of resources at their disposal if they really want to just understand an issue as best they can. What I would love to know is how many members of Congress, representatives, and senators actually sit down and read any of the reports that are created from the GAO, from the Congressional Research Service. How much do they actually understand about what's going on in the US? And how much of their job is just acting as partisan grandstanding compared to understanding the actual world that they're operating in? That's what I'd love to know it, but it's all secret. They're not going to disclose those kinds of things to protect the research histories of Congress people. I looked into it. The Library of Congress is one of the largest libraries on the whole planet. They've got a huge number of books. They've got a huge amount of resources at their disposal. A lot of it's just there for Congress people to use. The general public can't always access some of these materials. It's a difficult situation. But that also goes to that issue of that the older they get, the sort of slower their mind gets, that there's less of a hunger to even learn information and to understand, that you get more solidified in your thinking. And if you're operating 3 centuries ago, the world will move by you.
Uh, yeah, there in this country, there's like a bargain, a social bargain, if you will, that you got to put in your time, and that as you age, you should expect. Then not for everybody, but for those in power, that as you age, you should expect professional advancement. This is not achievable for everyone. So it doesn't go to everyone. But for those who have gotten on the tracks, the fortunate sons, let's say, there is the expectation, and perhaps there is the, gosh, what can I call it? There's the tolerance with trying the old way. And, oh, if I can just voice the concern properly, that's what counts. But what are you going to do about it? So, as opposed to perhaps what we would advocate for, which would be like security and a degree of comfort in age, yes, but across your life, we would really hope. But for the few, there's the expectation that that their income would continue to grow even as the sharpness of their mind declines. Like in some fields, some people can probably keep it up, but
I don't actually think for some of those who cling to power, I don't actually think it's a money thing because their pensions are really good for members of the Senate and the House if they're there for a certain amount of time. It's actually really quite good and generous in their healthcare and all that. What it is power is that feeling relevant, right? That once they reach a certain level of accomplishment, they don't want to be set aside. They want to have a say and they want the world to know that they've had a say. I'm not so sure there's any real space within our system. The only exception I can think of is actually judges. So when judges retire, they can join the traveling circuit of judges and they can sit in on cases and still issue rulings and stuff. It's part of the whole culture. It's actually really fascinating, but that's one of the only exceptions I can think of because when a president retires, they're not coming back and making decisions and having any kind of influence. When a member of the Senate or the House retires, they're not coming back and voting on anything and having any kind of say or influence. And so they just cling to power. But going to your point of you reach a certain age and you have these certain like expectations of more money, more security, more responsibility. Part of the issue in the American system, strangely enough, is that to get to the peak of power, we saw this with Biden, it takes a really long time to become vice president or president. And once you reach that point, it's I made it. I don't want to give it up. Then you reach a point where your mind may not be as quick or as sharp or the ability to react as quickly and you go on the national stage in a debate and just can't quite keep up the pace. And everybody sees it, and then by then it was too late. That's why I think primaries are super important. If we're really discussing how do you get these people in positions of power that have been there just forever to actually do their job, demonstrate that they're still competent and able to represent the people in a capable and effective manner, is you have primaries and you have debates in those primaries where you have them defend all the decisions they've made and you have them advocate. What am I going to do to make tomorrow a better day than today? What are you going to do? Because in these safe positions, it's like there's no real challenge. And if there's no real challenge, then your senses get dulled. You're not actually getting any kind of performance review. In some senses, primaries are like a performance review for people in the safe districts because it's the only avenue to credibly challenge them staying the incumbent. So that's one way would be to just have more primaries for everything. But then you'd have to get American voters actually to vote and participate, and that's a
Yeah,
whole separate thing.
yeah,
Australia fixes that by having mandatory voting. Everybody votes. If you say, "Oh, I don't want to vote," then you have to provide a reason. Or I don't know if it's jail time, but it's a fine. I'm pretty sure. But that's a different kind of strategy. If you get everybody to vote, then ideally, at least it's more representative that we're not getting just like the most ardent, most single issue driven people turning out to vote in primaries, where the candidates just cater to, a very narrow, arguably more easily winnable strategy than having to be creative and advocate for policies and issues that create meaningful change and improve the lives of others.
yeah, yeah. So now I'm gonna not flip the feed. I'm gonna take like a devil's advocate position. Because I've heard people say, and not that this is a representation of an average voter, but I heard people say in 24, I'd rather elect a corpse than elect Trump. I heard people say that. Now, are they being serious? Some of them are. But does that represent average view? I don't know. But when I vote for certain members of Congress and or the Senate, when I think about their age, what I might think about their age, what I might be inclined to argue, would be something like, they're old, sure, but they've got capable staff. The staff is comprised of people a lot like me, probably more politically and more academically educated, quicker than me, but people in like a station of life similar to my own. It's like that they have staffs. It's the iron clash of incentives. I email my congressman regularly. All good. I make that argument. Should I stop making that argument? Should I support primary challengers to them who might have a little more zing and pep? And are there steps that the individual can take? And I know that we got stuck at this, so I don't know if we know right now. But what do you think?
No, your argument still holds even if we have primaries because the staff will still stay with them if they win. The whole point of having more primaries that are actually better funded and having like actual credible candidates is to keep the elected representatives on their toes, is to actually make them work
Ah,
for it. Because what the problem that's happening is that if they become too comfortable in their position, they forget the fact that like they're elected to the position because they just pass go, collect the money, and keep carrying on. Part of the point of having those primaries is to have those debates, is to get them to actually show up and defend what they're doing, right? Because here's the main issue: a lot of journalism has fallen to the wayside and people don't really have the ability to ask their representatives tough questions. They can ask them questions, they can send them emails, they can call them, but what they're not getting is the areas of conflict and compromise where the representative will actually have to make a decision. Because you can show up to Congress and just be very passive, just vote on all the stuff and never actually write a bill, co-author a bill, write amendments. You could just show up and do that. But is that the best you could do? And the question becomes, are these representatives being the best they could be? And what are mechanisms in the existing system to encourage them, to incentivize them to be better? If lobbying is the way that happens, if it's just a money thing where they get more money in their elections and so they just represent like the interests that help fund them, that sucks, right? What about the people? What about the people who don't have money and the voters and the electorate? What is their opportunity really to even ask them questions or to advocate for positions in a realistic manner that they're going to get heard? And the answer to that is debates, right? Or town halls or something. There's going to be some way to encourage the representatives to actually communicate with their constituents and for their constituents to actually hear how their representatives think and act on their job. That's why I say primary debates would be better, or just debates in general, competition encourages more innovation and incentivizes more rapid progress or change. If they don't feel the external pressure of actually having to apply and run for their job, then there's less of a motivation on a day to actually show up and do the job. So one of the things about Congress is that they're in recess an awful lot of the time, that they don't actually even meet and talk all that much. If you look at the whole year, especially with the shutdown, the House hasn't even been in a full session for what, 6 weeks? That's a long time of just not talking or doing anything. I guess if you don't like government and you don't like what government does, great, right? They show up and do nothing and get paid. Wonderful. Nothing's happened. Hooray. But if you think government's a tool to improve the lives of people and that you got to be constantly like tweaking around the edges, fixing it, refining it, repairing it, and making sure everything runs smoothly, well, the mechanics of government are frankly the representatives because they control the money spigot. They control the levers of power. If they're just not doing anything, then nothing gets done. That's not super great for a country of 330 plus million people. That's very complex and very geographically diverse and gets hit a lot with natural disasters like earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, fires, and all that. Like the people at the top need to actually figure out what the problems are and then address them, or the problems get worse. And then you have another problem that you still have to address. It just costs more money, right? And I wonder why we're in debt to such a degree, because maybe the cheaper options or the better options or the options that could have saved us money could have happened, but didn't because there was no political will to compromise. And part of the reason you don't have a political will to compromise is that if these elected representatives feel so safe and so comfortable in their positions that they don't feel pressure to do anything to withhold, to maintain, to keep their job, then sometimes the best options they have at their disposal are just not to do anything, right? Just look for money from lobbyists and just coast until they go on to the next thing. There's a reason, frankly, that the House of Representatives has 2-year terms. They're supposed to run for their job and defend their choices and to constantly be that sort of churn of elected representatives because they're the ones that are supposed to get things done. They're it. They're the ones. You got to motivate them. And right now, it's only a handful of seats that are actually competitive. That's this whole gerrymandering fight where Trump wants to gerrymander more so that there's more safe seats so he doesn't have to worry about Congress saying no to him. That's not how checks and balances work. There is no check. There's no balance. That's my thought. More primary debates.
Mondays with Mike.